12 miles off the Virginia coast, an island in the Chesapeake Bay has lost 2/3 of its land since 1850. Fewer than 500 people still live on what's left. Their shoreline shrinks by feet each year. Engineers know how to save it. The full price tag runs into the hundreds of millions, and nobody's written the check. Pull up a satellite image of Tangier Island, Virginia, and what you're looking at resembles a hand slowly being dragged underwater. Fingers of marsh trail off into open bay. The solid ground, the part where people actually live, park their boats, bury their dead, is a narrow strip barely a mile and a half long. The whole place sits so low that from a boat approaching the harbor, the rooftops appear to float directly on the water, as if someone set a village on a raft and forgot to anchor it. That image isn't far from the truth. Tangier's highest ground barely clears 4 feet above mean high water, and most of the island sits lower than that. There's no bedrock, no bluff, no cliff face. The island is a platform of marsh sediment, soft, compressible, and old. It was built by the Chesapeake over thousands of years, and the Chesapeake has been taking it back on its own schedule. Most people hear sinking island and picture something gradual. Geological time, inches per century. Tangier doesn't work like that. The land loss here is fast enough that residents alive today can point to open water and say, with no exaggeration, I played there as a kid. Not on the shore, not near the water, on ground that no longer exists. The northern section of the island, a ridge called Uphards, was once a populated area. People lived there, walked there. It had its own identity within the community. The settlement at Uphards was abandoned nearly a century ago as flooding made it unlivable, and since then the land itself has kept disappearing. Today, Uphards is marsh and open water. It didn't vanish in a single catastrophic event. It went slowly, tide by tide, storm by storm, until one year there was nothing left to stand on. Residents alive today have watched the last solid ground at Uphards dissolve into bay, trees that once stood on dry land now underwater, foundations that once held houses now submerged at high tide. Here's what makes Tangier's situation worse than a simple sea level rise story. The island isn't being attacked from one direction. It's being hit from 3. The first is the one everyone thinks of. The water is rising. Sea levels in the Chesapeake Bay have been climbing steadily, and the rate is accelerating. That alone would be a problem for a place this flat, but it's not alone. The second force is underneath. The entire mid-Atlantic coastline is sinking, slowly, measurably, and for a reason that has nothing to do with anything happening today. During the last ice age, massive glaciers pressed down on the northern part of the continent. The land south of the ice sheet, including the Chesapeake region, bulged upwards slightly in response, the way a mattress rises around the spot where you press your fist. When the glaciers melted, the north started rebounding, springing back up, and the southern bulge began settling back down. That process is still happening. The land beneath Tangier is subsiding at roughly 1 to 2 millimeters per year on top of the sea level rise. The island is sinking partly because of ice that melted 12,000 years ago. The third force is lateral. Waves, especially storm-driven waves rolling across the open fetch of the bay, are chewing the island's soft edges. The western shoreline has been losing an estimated 15 feet per year in its most exposed stretches, with some areas losing even more. That's not erosion on a geological timescale. That's a front yard disappearing between one birthday and the next. Any one of those 3 forces, the rise, the drop, the gnaw, might be survivable for a low island with enough engineering. All 3 stacked together are compounding, and the math is ugly. Since 1850, Tangier has lost an estimated 2/3 of its total landmass. Not 2/3 of some uninhabited marsh fringe. 2/3 of the island. Entire neighborhoods worth of ground now exist only in old surveys and the memories of people who grew up walking on them. And the Chesapeake Bay itself adds a layer to this that most people never consider. The bay isn't a permanent feature of the landscape in the way the Great Lakes or the Pacific coast feel permanent. It's a drowned river valley. Before the last ice age ended and the melt raised ocean levels, the Susquehanna River carved a deep channel through this region on its way to the sea. As the water rose, it flooded that valley and created the bay. Tangier didn't form on a coastline. The coastline came to it. The island is a leftover, a remnant of higher ground in a landscape that has been drowning in slow motion for thousands of years. What's happening now is just the latest chapter of a process that predates every human being who ever set foot there. To put the scale in terms that matter, the habitable area of Tangier today, the part with houses, streets, the school, the churches, the harbor, covers roughly 83 acres. That's about the footprint of a mid-sized shopping mall and its parking lot. That's the dry ground that the island's remaining residents share with their boats, their crab shanties, their cemetery, and their airstrip. And every year, the edges of that footprint get a little smaller. Look at a map from 1850 and overlay today's shoreline, and the difference is the kind of thing that makes you lean closer to the screen. The old island wraps around the current one like a ghost. All that vanished area isn't underground or hidden. It's just bay now. Water where land used to be, with nothing to mark the change except survey lines no one looks at. So Tangier is not waiting to sink. It's been sinking the whole time. The question that should be nagging at you right now isn't whether the island is in trouble. That part is settled. The question is why, given everything you just heard, anyone still wakes up there every morning. The answer isn't stubbornness, or at least not only stubbornness. It's an economy that literally cannot function anywhere else. The thing outsiders get wrong about Tangier, almost every time, is assuming the people who live there are stuck, that they're too poor to leave, too stubborn to adapt, or too sentimental to do the math. The truth is simpler and stranger. Tangier's location is not a liability. It's the entire business model. The island sits in the middle of some of the most productive blue crab waters in the Chesapeake Bay. And middle is the key word. Tangier's watermen, the local term for the crabbers and oystermen who work these waters, wake up essentially on top of their fishing grounds. By the time a mainland crabber out of Crisfield, Maryland, or Ononcock, Virginia, has motored out to the same water, a Tangier waterman has already been pulling pots. That head start is not a small advantage. It's the whole margin. Blue crab is a low-margin business. The price per bushel fluctuates. Fuel costs are real. And an independent waterman operating a small boat doesn't have the luxury of absorbing a bad week. Every hour of extra runtime is fuel burned, daylight lost, and catch reduced. Tangier's position in the bay eliminates that overhead. The island functions, in economic terms, like a forward operating base planted directly on the resource. You can't replicate that advantage from a dock on the mainland. The geography is the paycheck. This is why the phrase, "just relocate them," which comes up in nearly every article and comment section about Tangier, misses the point so completely. You can move the people. You can move the houses. You cannot move the geographic advantage of being 12 miles closer to the crabbing grounds than your nearest competitor. Relocate Tangier's watermen to the mainland and you don't save their way of life. You end it. The commute alone would gut the economics. And make no mistake, a large share of working residents on the island are watermen or work in the crab trade, sorting, packing, shipping. The harbor is packed with boats in a way that looks almost absurd relative to the island's size, like a parking garage attached to a cottage. Crabbing isn't just the primary industry. It is, for practical purposes, the only industry, supplemented by a thin tourist season that brings day trippers over on ferries from the mainland during the summer months. Step onto Tangier and the landscape of daily life looks nothing like mainland America. There are almost no cars. The island is so compact, with a few narrow lanes connecting the 3 remaining ridges of habitable ground, that golf carts are the standard transportation. There's one school, and it handles kindergarten through 12th grade in a single building. Medical care comes from a clinic staffed not by a full-time doctor, but by a physician's assistant on rotation. Need anything beyond what that clinic can handle? A dental appointment, a specialist, an emergency that can't wait, and you're getting on a boat or a small plane. Internet and cell service have improved in recent years, but for most of Tangier's inhabited history, the island operated in a communication gap that the mainland takes for granted. Every service, every supply, every piece of mail arrives by water or air. The ferry from Crisfield takes roughly an hour and runs seasonally. In winter, the island's isolation deepens. Bad weather can cancel crossings. A waterman who breaks an arm in January is dealing with a logistics problem that a person in any mainland town would solve with a 10-minute drive. Here's the part that turns the economics from difficult to grim. The population has been in freefall. Tangier's peak was somewhere around 1,100 residents in the early 1900s. By 2010, it had dropped to about 727. By the 2020 census, it was 436, a 40% decline in a single decade. Recent estimates put it lower still, possibly under 300. Young people leave for school or work and almost never come back. Why would they? The mainland offers better pay, better services, cellular coverage that doesn't cut out, and ground that isn't actively disappearing beneath the foundation. What this means is that the community is aging in place. The median age has climbed past 65. The school enrollment is shrinking. Every year that passes without a young family choosing to stay, the demographic math worsens. And this creates a feedback loop that operates independently of the water. Fewer residents means less tax revenue, which means less money for infrastructure and services, which makes the island less livable, which drives out more residents. The crab economy might be viable for another generation, but the community infrastructure around it, the school, the clinic, the ferry demand, the church congregations, needs a population floor to function. Drop below that floor and the services collapse, and the services collapsing is what finally empties a place like this, often faster than the water ever could. There's a dark irony buried in all of this. The isolation that makes Tangier economically viable, the remoteness that plants its watermen directly on the crabbing grounds, is the same isolation that bleeds it of young people, medical access, and political relevance. The feature that feeds the island is the same feature that's starving it. You can't solve one side without wrecking the other. So the economy needs the island. The island is disappearing. The population is shrinking. And every year, the gap between what Tangier needs to survive and what it can sustain on its own gets wider. At some point, maybe soon, maybe a decade from now, someone in a position of authority is going to have to make a decision. Save it or let it go. The strange thing is, that decision has technically already been studied. Engineers have drawn up plans. And the reason nothing has been built has everything to do with a kind of math that nobody in office wants to say out loud. Here's what the numbers actually look like. A short-term fix, using dredged material from federal navigation channels to shore up the most vulnerable stretches of shoreline and buy the island roughly 20 more years, has been estimated at around $25 million. That's a meaningful project, and even that hasn't been fully funded. But the comprehensive solution, the one that would actually stabilize the island long-term, with seawalls, breakwaters, elevated infrastructure, and restored shoreline, runs to an estimated $250 to $350 million. That's real money, not impossible money. The federal government has spent over $700 million rebuilding Poplar Island in the middle of the same bay, and no one lives there. It's a wildlife habitat, but real money nonetheless. And the political math around spending it on Tangier is brutal. Divide that cost by the island's current population, somewhere between 300 and 450 people, depending on which estimate you trust, and the per capita figure lands in the range of $700,000 per resident. Run that number in front of an appropriations committee and watch the room go quiet. Every dollar spent on Tangier is a dollar not spent on a flooded neighborhood in Norfolk with 50,000 residents, or a crumbling bridge in Hampton Roads that carries 100,000 cars a day. The math isn't about whether Tangier deserves protection. It's about whether any elected official can justify that per-person price tag to constituents who are also flooding, also crumbling, also waiting in line for federal infrastructure money. And here's the spiral that makes it worse. Every year the population drops, the cost per capita goes up. The engineering cost stays roughly the same. Water doesn't care how many people live behind the wall, but the political math gets uglier with every family that leaves. Delay isn't neutral. Delay is a compounding problem. Each year of inaction makes the case harder to make, which makes another year of inaction more likely, which makes the case harder still. The frustrating part is that a proof of concept already exists. The Army Corps of Engineers built a rock jetty along part of the island's western shore in 1989, the side taking the worst beating from open bay wave action, and it worked. The stretch behind that jetty stabilized. Before the seawall went up, the western coast was losing 25 to 30 feet of shoreline a year. Since then, according to the mayor, they haven't lost an inch on that stretch. Walk along the western edge of Tangier today, and you can see the evidence with your own eyes. On one side, the jetty holds the line. On the other, the unprotected shoreline continues to melt backward, year after year, storm after storm. The fix is not a mystery. It's not experimental. Part of it is already built, and the rest of the island is washing away beside it. There's a layer to this story that every journalist who has visited Tangier in the last decade has noticed, and it requires some care to talk about honestly. Tangier is a deeply conservative community. Many of its residents have expressed skepticism toward the language of climate change, not necessarily disputing that their island is shrinking, but resisting the framing that connects it to broader global warming policy. This became national news around 2017, when the island briefly entered the political spotlight and its mayor spoke publicly about his doubts. The structural irony here is hard to miss. The community most visibly losing ground to rising seas is politically aligned with the coalition least likely to fund climate adaptation projects. And the politicians most inclined to champion climate spending represent districts where Tangier's particular kind of place, small, rural, remote, conservative, doesn't generate votes or attention. The island falls into a gap between two political identities, and that gap is wide enough to drown in. But pointing this out as a gotcha, as plenty of commentators have, misses something important. Tangier's residents aren't denying that their island is eroding. They can see it. They live it. What they're pushing back against is being turned into a symbol for someone else's argument. And there's a legitimate frustration underneath that pushback. The island has been losing land for over a century, long before climate change entered the national vocabulary, and the federal government wasn't helping then either. From where they stand, the framing changed, but the funding never arrived. What has arrived, in place of concrete and rock, is a quieter federal posture that goes by a polite name when it's named at all: managed retreat. There is no official document that says we are going to let Tangier Island go. No politician has stood at a podium and declared the island a lost cause. But the absence of funding is the policy. When you study a problem, acknowledge the problem, identify the solution, price the solution, confirm the solution works on the one stretch where you actually built it, and then don't fund the rest. You've made a decision. You've just made it by not making it. Compare Tangier to the barrier islands up and down the Atlantic coast that receive regular beach replenishment from the Army Corps. Millions of cubic yards of sand pumped onto tourist shorelines every few years at enormous cost to protect hotels and vacation homes. Those projects get funded because the economic output behind the beach justifies the expense. The tax revenue from a resort town dwarfs what Tangier generates. The crab fleet doesn't compete with beachfront property values in the infrastructure Hunger Games. And then there's the comparison that cuts closest. Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana, a small island community in the bayou, largely indigenous, losing land to the same combination of subsidence, sea level rise, and erosion. The federal government offered roughly $48 million in relocation funding to move residents to higher ground. It was the first federal climate relocation program in the country. The process has been slow, contentious, and deeply painful. Many residents resisted or were excluded by eligibility rules. The new community doesn't replicate what was lost. You can move people. You cannot move a place. As of now, no comparable relocation program has been extended to Tangier. Whether that's because the political conditions aren't right, because the residents would refuse, or because no one has pushed hard enough is an open question. What's not open is the timeline. Every year of inaction doesn't just cost money, it costs land. And unlike a building that can be repaired after decades of neglect, marsh sediment that washes into the Chesapeake is gone. It doesn't come back. There's no undo button for an island. Delay isn't just inaction. Delay is demolition on an installment plan, so the water is rising. The money isn't coming. The population is shrinking. By every rational measure, the story should be over. But Tangier is still there, and the force holding it together, the thing that has outlasted every study, every news cycle, every political promise that never materialized, is something no Army Corps report has a line item for. Tangier Island has been continuously inhabited since the late 1700s. Some of the families living there today can trace their lineage back to the original settlers. 8, 9, 10 generations on the same narrow strip of ground. To put that in perspective, these families were on Tangier before the Constitution was ratified. Their tenure on this island is older than the country that governs it. That kind of continuity does something to a community that's hard to quantify and impossible to replicate. Tangier isn't a neighborhood where people happen to live near each other. It's a place where everyone is, to some degree, related. Where the church, Methodist, and central to daily life in a way that most mainland Americans haven't experienced since the 1950s, functions not just as a place of worship, but as a town hall, a social safety net, and the gravitational center that holds the community's identity in place. Take the church out of Tangier, and you wouldn't just lose Sunday services. You'd lose the structure that makes collective life on a disappearing island psychologically bearable. And then there's the voice. Tangier's residents speak a dialect of English that linguists have studied for decades. It's been described, with varying degrees of accuracy, as a relic of older British English, sometimes sensationally called Elizabethan in news segments, which overstates the case but points at something real. The dialect preserves features, vowel sounds, rhythms, certain archaic constructions that disappeared from mainland American English generations ago. It evolved in isolation, the way island speech always does, shaped by the fact that for most of the island's history, the only people you talked to were the people on the island. That dialect is not a museum exhibit. It's the sound of a living community. Children on Tangier still grow up speaking it. But the pool of speakers is shrinking at exactly the rate. The population is shrinking, and there is no second population of Tangier dialect speakers somewhere else. When the island empties, if the island empties, that variety of English dies with it. Not gradually, the way languages usually fade, absorbed into something bigger, abruptly. Because the place that sustained it will be underwater. This is the part of Tangier's story that statistics can't carry. The island is losing more than acreage. It's losing a culture that exists nowhere else and cannot be relocated in any meaningful sense. You can move people to the mainland, build them houses, hand them the keys. You cannot move what it means to wake up surrounded by water in a place your family has worked for 2.5 centuries. That identity is site-specific. It is welded to the geography. Pull it off the island and it doesn't transplant. It just ends. The cemetery makes this literal in a way that's almost too precise to be accidental. Tangier's graveyards, the places where generations of those founding families are buried, sit on ground so low that headstones are at risk of tidal flooding. At the old Canaan cemetery on Uphards, graves have already washed into the bay, and archaeologists have excavated remains before the water could claim them. The dead are going underwater before the living leave. That's not a metaphor someone crafted for dramatic effect. It's a tide chart. The same water that's eating the shoreline is reaching for the graves of the people who built the place. Meanwhile, the school keeps getting smaller. Enrollment numbers have been declining in step with the population, and the trajectory points toward a threshold that every dying small town in America knows by heart. When a school drops below a certain number of students, keeping it open stops making financial sense to the district. When the school closes, the last young families with children lose the one institution that was holding them in place. And when those families leave, the median age jumps, the tax-based contracts, and the remaining services, the clinic, the ferry schedule, the post office, start falling like dominoes. Tangier hasn't hit that threshold yet, but the margin is thin and getting thinner. Some projections, and they are projections, not certainties, suggest that Tangier could become uninhabitable far sooner than most people assume. The most recent peer-reviewed study projects that the island's 3 ridges could convert to uninhabitable wetland between the 2030s and early 2050s, with the first ridge potentially going within the next decade. Those dates are close enough that people currently living on Tangier may see it happen. This isn't a warning for their grandchildren, it's a warning for them. And there's one last twist the island has left. As the Chesapeake warms, and it is warming, some marine biologists have noted shifts in blue crab patterns and productivity that could, under certain conditions, benefit crabbing grounds in the Middle Bay. The livelihood might actually outlast the land. Tangier's watermen could find themselves with a viable catch and no island to come home to. The economic engine survives. The platform it operates from doesn't. If you designed a parable about adaptation and loss, you couldn't make it crueler than that. Tangier Island is easy to treat as a curiosity, a quirky place, a charming anachronism with golf carts and crab pots and an accent nobody else has. But the longer you look at it, the less it works as a novelty item and the more it works as a preview. Hundreds of low-lying communities along the American coastline, in the Chesapeake, along the Gulf, across the Carolina Sounds, are facing the same combination of forces: rising water, subsiding land, eroding shorelines, shrinking populations, and a funding model that protects places in proportion to their economic output rather than their need. Tangier is just the one where the timeline is shortest and the math is most exposed. Pull up a map one more time. Draw the island's outline in 1850, wide, solid, sprawling across the bay. Draw today's outline inside it, a fraction of the original, pinched and narrow. Now draw the projected outline for 2050, a sliver, if it's there at all. 3 shapes, nested, each one smaller than the last. That compression is not a natural disaster. It is a series of decisions to build, to stay, to defer, to underfund, to look away, layered on top of a geography that was never going to wait for anyone to make up their mind. The water does not care who lives there. It does not care who votes for what. It takes the land on its own schedule, and the only question it leaves behind is whether anyone will decide the people on that land were worth saving before the answer no longer matters.